Over the last couple of weeks, I've chronicled my experiences ranging from elementary school, middle school, and high school. I've mentioned some symptoms, but there are still some others that have caused me some issues and also some different symptoms that have helped me learn how to overcome adversity. Hi again, everybody. Braden Rousai here with another episode of My Extra Ability. And yes, before you ask, I did get a haircut. Now I don't look like the mop that I used to. And today we're going to be talking about symptoms, mainly the symptoms that have impacted me the most. Now, when I talk about these symptoms, please keep this in mind. People that have autism are impacted in various different ways. Everybody's going to have different issues with forms of autism. The symptoms that I'm going to discuss are just the ones that have affected me the most. So if I don't talk about a certain symptom or situation that doesn't affect me, that's just because I haven't had that issue. And it'll vary amongst everyone else that you talk to that have a form of autism. Throughout the last 5 weeks, I have covered various different themes and symptoms, and I've referenced them plenty of times throughout the last few episodes. The 5 that impact me the most: behavioral disturbances, inappropriate social interaction, intense focus on one topic, not engaging in play with peers, and preoccupation with specific topics. The behavioral disturbances were mostly throughout elementary school, along with inappropriate social interaction. Those are kind of intertwined together, in my opinion. Not engaging in play with peers, obviously it adapts because once you get to my age, 23 years old, you don't play with your peers, you interact with them. The ones that help me the most: the intense focus on one subject and preoccupation with specific topics. I believe when I first started this last month that my biggest focus or occupation is wrestling. Nowadays, I'm going through kind of a football stage because the football season, hopefully, is right around the corner. Over the last couple of weeks, I've created record books for schools and teams that I've been associated with. And as you can see on the screen here, it can get pretty intense, mainly just to keep myself occupied and because it's something that I'm interested in. And with my broadcasting, that helps me immensely because instead of having to write down notes, I can just read it, absorb it, and spew it out. So those 2 symptoms have been the ones that have helped me the most in my professional career. But there are still some other symptoms that I may or may not have mentioned. I know I've mentioned at least a couple of these, but I didn't really go into specific detail about how they impact me and help shape me into the person that I am. One is the most ironic thing, which is delay in learning how to speak. It may surprise some people that I talk for a living, I broadcast for a living, do play-by-play for games, public address for games, all of that fun jazz. But not a lot of people know that I didn't talk until I was 4 years old. And that led to my parents wanting to test and see if there was something up with me. That kind of built up into a learning, not necessarily a disability, but a learning difficulty. I never had tremendous trouble learning. Not to toot my own horn, but I do think I'm a pretty intelligent person, at least when I apply myself. But I was always in the classes that had the teacher aides or the second teacher that would monitor the students that were in the secondary classes. Now, those aides have helped me out in different ways socially, but especially whenever I had a tough time understanding a subject. For example, I was pretty rough with science, mainly the natural science, the biology. Always was good in chemistry for some reason. I don't know why. But they would always help me out and relating things in terms that I can understand. It's not like where typical people go to tutoring on their own. I had a tutor that I was basically assigned to help me out with certain topics and with homework, with tests, etc. I know I've mentioned these self-abusive behaviors that I had, particularly in middle school, which ended up me being exiled, which rightfully so, to be quite frank with you. But some of those self-abusive behaviors, they tie into unusual reactions in social situations. When people I thought were bullying me, I had the natural instinct to threaten physical harm upon myself, almost as if to show that the bullies or the people that were picking on me were impacting me to the point where I would threaten to hurt myself for God forbid, something worse. There are ways to counter this. The main one for me was having a counselor. I had a counselor that would come to my house. I had a counselor that would come into my classrooms. I do remember in 8th grade when my counselors would come into the class. And me, I was embarrassed because no one else had to have something even remotely close to this. I know I mentioned the secondary teachers or the aides, but those are for several people that are in a certain situation, and more often than not, those people were in the same classes. This was just someone doing their job and monitoring one guy, which was me. Lack of understanding social cues was a big one. Middle school and high school were particularly tough for me, especially middle school. In the last video, I mentioned that the guys that I thought were picking on me were just being guys and being sarcastic, like how a lot of guys are with other people. That's just one example of these social cues that I misrepresented. One thing for me that I didn't really touch on before was I could not read feelings. I had to teach myself what these different everyday emotions are. And just like the verbal social cues, if it wasn't completely obvious that someone was happy, sad, angry, whatever, then I just wouldn't understand it. I had to teach myself how to be able to pick up on these, not just verbal cues, but facial cues, physical cues. And the only way I was able to do that was by studying other people. Look, a lot of people think that I'm an odd dude. And is that true? To an extent, probably. But the thing that people don't recognize is that I have to think outside of the box, go about in an unorthodox way to figure out how to fit in with society. Even whenever I was in early middle school and people were picking on me, people would pick up on the fact that I was being observant. I don't know if that's the correct word to use, but I would basically stare at other people and sink in how they're acting around others. And this ranged from everybody: teachers, students, parents, siblings, you name it. Even whenever my younger brother was taking part in his youth football practices in elementary school, I would observe how the kids are interacting amongst each other. If there was a kid they wanted to get away from and they wanted to be nice about it, I would observe how they do that. Little did I know that most of the time I was the one that everybody was trying to get away from. But being that oddball, and I use that in quotations because that's just how I learned, it taught me a lot about people. It taught me how people feel happy, people feel sad, people are sarcastic with other people, how they're being nice to other people, if they really think that someone is a true friend or if they're just using someone for another's personal gain. Speaking of being an oddball, unusual reactions in social situations. A lot of times I would freak out when seemingly there was no reason to. One common trait with people with autism is that everything must be in a distinct way. It's very difficult for people like me that are on the spectrum to adapt to different ways of living. Whenever I'm around a certain group of people, I will only talk about things that I want to talk about. Is it selfish? To an extent, yes, it is. But it's the only thing that brings me comfort and makes me feel as if I am a relevant part of a group or scenario. For example, my younger brother's football friends or teammates, whenever they're around, I always talk about football. I would always bring up some sort of memory, which memory is another thing on its own. But going back to that record book, I would lay out all of these different records, such as season records, career records, single game records. Talk about other teams that were in the area, high school, collegiately, professionally, because that was the only thing I knew. But if someone starts talking about something that I wasn't familiar with, say for instance, math. If there's some sort of math homework, I would always relate to it in a football way. Well, how do you remember this? Okay, well, I remember in yards, 236 minus 119 is 117. It would always come around to that one topic. If I'm with my friends that aren't interested in sports, maybe I'll talk about movies, video games, musicians. But if I don't know something about a topic, I'm silent, which this relates to my difficulty with two-way conversation. This is the one I struggle with the most in the present times. And it's not just because we're on lockdown, which I haven't really talked to anybody since we've been on lockdown for 2 months? But I was always taught, when in doubt, shut your mouth. I relate to this in broadcasting, and I relate to this whenever I don't know what to talk about. Usually whenever I'm quiet in a situation, it's either because, one, I'm in a situation that I'm unfamiliar with and it's kind of jarring to me, or two, I don't know what the heck I'm talking about. And I don't want to risk me looking foolish in front of this group of people, even if they were close friends or people I just met. And that's a hindrance a lot of times, especially in my latest job. I was athletic communications assistant at Frostburg State, and I was in a completely unfamiliar territory. Did not know anybody. And I didn't know how to relate to any of these people that were my coworkers. And I still don't. So whenever we're in the office and everyone's goofing around, I'm silent and I just mind my own business. There will probably be a lot of people that take that the wrong way and think that I am being arrogant or egotistical because I'm not talking to them. But no, it's because I just don't know what to say. So, when in doubt, shut your mouth. The last one I want to talk about is lack of empathy. I was interviewed about a month ago by the Autism Caring Center in Pittsburgh, and I was asked what the biggest misconception about people on the autism spectrum is, and I didn't know how to answer it, so I just came up with something that I pulled right out of my ass. But whenever I stopped and thought about it, I think the lack of empathy is the biggest misconception. In my case, I don't think that I'm not empathetic. I actually think it's the exact opposite. I'm a little bit too empathetic for other people and for ways to express myself. A lot of things that have caused me problems are my emotions. I've had issues with anger in the past. I've had issues with freaking out and being upset about things not going a certain way. Another example, the person that interviewed me on the Autism Caring Center is my first ex-girlfriend's mom. And I truly believe that the reason that her and I broke up, I really think that a lot of that was because I was too caught up in emotions. I was too empathetic and too emotional about many different things. And usually after I get out of a relationship, I don't handle it well. I get too in my feelings, and more often than not, it leads to me burning a bridge. Have I done that with previous ex-girlfriends? Of course I have. I think I did that the most with my first ex-girlfriend. Her and I don't even acknowledge each other's existence, but her mom and I are still very good friends. And I think that people that are on the spectrum are not lacking empathy. I think they have too much empathy, or at least that's how I am. I can't speak for the thousands of people that have autism, but that's where I'm coming from. So that's it for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And once again, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next week.